ESC Rights Initiative. This is my name, Burton. You're all very welcome here today. We have a full programme. We're running a little bit late, so if you bear with us. The purpose of this conference is really to reignite the debate on ESC rights, and specifically to draw attention to the need to move from symbolism to implementation. We have a range of speakers arranged in 3 panels, as you see from your programme, and there's plenty of space for the panels to contribute, and there's some space for contributions from the floor. So without further ado, can I introduce our keynote speaker, Jimmy Burton. He's a barrister with 30th Street Chambers in London. He specialises in welfare law and social justice. He's chair of the Just Fair, which is a charity dedicated to the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights. Jimmy.
Hello everyone, thanks very much to Aidan and indeed the initiative for inviting me to address you today. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm also very encouraged to be here. It was only about 6 years ago that I had the not unfamiliar feeling that I was wrong again about something. I'd underestimated, I think, the value of human rights, and particularly social rights, in the context of trying to address social injustice. Indeed, it was a concern about social injustice which had taken me to the law in the first place, and yet, along with others, I had underestimated, as I say, the potential value in human rights in tackling that social injustice. And I'm encouraged because even in that relatively short period of time, 6 years or so, support for and momentum behind economic and social rights has grown in a way that certainly then I wouldn't have anticipated or foreseen. And I think that is very encouraging, and indeed today's event is testament to that. Now, I appreciate there's nobody more zealous than a convert, and I'm going to try my best not to use this opportunity to politicise about economic, social and cultural rights, and try to give a more balanced picture. If you want to hear the polemic, perhaps we can meet in the bar later. Which is not to say, of course, that I don't believe that economic and social rights should be implemented, but only that it would be proper and fair to try and respect some of the objections to implementation of those rights before we take the plunge, as it were, and try to have them incorporated. So this address is going to be set out in 4 parts. I'm going to give you a brief introduction and a sort of history of economic, social and cultural rights. Then move on to a short critique of some of the objections to enforceable economic, social and cultural rights. Then say something about the content of these rights, which is often misunderstood, before then finishing really by looking at some of the reasons why, at least in my opinion, now really is the time to take these rights more seriously and to take the steps necessary indeed to make them more meaningful. And that is the title of this conference. It's Making Economic, Social and Cultural Rights More Meaningful. And I don't wish to make too many assumptions, but I imagine most people are here today not because they wonder whether or not these rights really can be meaningful in a country of plenty like Ireland, but more that despite the roar of the Celtic tiger, there is still very serious social injustice in Ireland, and it's imperative that something should be done about it. So it seems to me that the title of this event is really redolent of something else altogether, which is often captured in the phrase that socio-economic rights are in some way the poor cousin of civil and political rights. Now, I actually don't much like that metaphor. I think economic and social rights and civil and political rights are much more closely related than cousins. They were conceived at the same time, And although they're not identical, like most tech twins, they are essentially and will forever be connected to one another, as I'll come on to try and show in due course. And the term that human rights practitioners use to explain that interconnectedness of human rights is their indivisibility. But the fact is, human rights were divided. 20 years after their conception, in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set out all rights, both economic, social, cultural rights and political rights, the White Heat of the Cold War forged two distinct international covenants on human rights. On the one hand, you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and signed only a week later, you have the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And there were different approaches to the enforcement of those rights from the very outset. The UN International Convention on Civil and Political Rights was accompanied by the establishment of a committee, the Human Rights Committee, and a mechanism by which that committee could hear individual complaints about breaches of those rights. This contrasted sharply with what the UN did in relation to the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Convention, sorry. That was simply given a form of intergovernmental committee that kind of debate these rights, but there was no means by which the UN, at least at that stage, could ensure those rights were actually enforced. And that duopoly was then mirrored in different forms of regional protection. For example, here in Europe, of course, we have the European Court of Human Rights, which seeks to uphold the European Convention on Human Rights, which only includes civil and political rights, whereas the European Committee on Social Rights can only hear collective complaints about the European Social Charter. So we see that that difference in treatment was not only set out by the UN, but was replicated both in Europe and various other regional bodies. Similarly, many parties to the UN Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, of which, of course, Ireland and indeed the UK are both, decided against having directly enforceable economic, social and cultural rights domestically. Again, reflecting this basic difference in treatment. But that post-Second World War orthodoxy about how to treat these rights really started to crumble even before the Cold War thawed. For reasons that I'll come on to explain, but particularly in the Global South, social rights movements started to try and pressurise and lobby the UN to take economic, social and cultural rights more seriously. And to some extent they achieved that. In the 1980s, the Intergovernmental Committee, which rarely met and rarely achieved anything, was replaced by a sort of equivalent to the Human Rights Committee, called the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now that committee is important. So I'm going to mention it quite a few times in the course of this address. I'm going to call it the committee, because if I don't abbreviate some of these phrases, I'm never going to get this done in time. So when I'm talking about the committee, here on in, that's the committee I'm talking about. So in the 80s, that committee was set up, and its purpose was to periodically review state parties to the convention to see how they were getting on, and to assess whether or not they were complying with its provisions. And indeed, most recently, it's also adopted the optional protocol, which allows state parties to accept the jurisdiction of the committee to hear individual complaints. And I'm very happy to say that Ireland has opted in. Unhappily, the UK has not. So economic, social and cultural rights certainly came of age, really, in her 40s. Those extra years spent exploring the importance of those rights in the developing world gave them an extra resonance, I should say, and relevance that sometimes perhaps those who focused on their Ivy League counterparts, civil and political rights, didn't fully appreciate. Yet it's correct to say that the ripple effect of that early geopolitical compromise that arose from the Cold War has meant, even now, that economic, social and cultural rights are, generally speaking, impoverished in the sense of being less readily, directly enforceable than their civil and political counterparts. Hence, the question about whether or not and how we make these rights more meaningful. So what is really going on here? What are the objections to economic and social and cultural rights all about? Well, before we assess those, I think it's important to establish what they're not about. The individual rights in the UN Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, were never explicitly denigrated as being any less worthy than civil and political rights, and neither were they particularly controversial. And indeed, why would they be? What legitimate political project, of left or right, doesn't aspire for its citizens an adequate standard of living, including housing, food and clothing, social security, education, the highest obtainable standards of health, meaningful and just conditions of work, access to cultural life, and the benefits of scientific progress? In other words, all the things the UN Covenant turned into rights. And indeed, this is to some extent borne out by history. With a few possible exceptions, there has never been an appetite among social democracies to roll back the post-Second World War consensus in favour of a welfare state, public services, and social security. So politically, there isn't really a problem, at least with the content of these rights. And philosophically, it's also readily understandable why the drafters of the 1948 UN Convention included economic and social rights alongside civil and political rights. Because whether it's based on a natural rights philosophy or universal normative requirements, there is really no conception of freedom which is realistically achievable without certain basic material conditions being present. Put simply, what is the point of having the freedom to choose if one doesn't have any choices? And what we know is that absent those choices, man all too readily becomes the means to another man's ends. Therefore, as the UN Declaration of Human Rights recognised, if all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, then surely each has a moral claim to his or her share of the pie. So the detractors have had to be a bit more nuanced in their objections to economic, social and cultural rights. And these will certainly be developed through the course of the day, so I'm only going to say a little bit about the following two. The first is, they say, economic, social and cultural rights are not really human rights at all, but mere aspirations. And this is exemplified by the fact that they depend on positive action by others for their fulfillment. The second objection is slightly more sophisticated. It says that as economic, social and cultural rights concern the allocation of resources, they are non-justiciable by the courts. Indeed, in representative democracies at least, it is illegitimate for the courts to make decisions about economic, social and cultural rights, as resource questions should remain the exclusive preserve of the legislature and the executive. And if some people insist that this unenforceability in the courts means that these aren't really rights at all, well, they are just being unnecessarily pedantic, as indeed lawyers have a tendency to be. So those are the two objections I'm going to look at in a moment. But before we do, I think it's worth saying something about what the public think about economic, social and cultural rights. First, polling by various organisations has shown that economic, social and cultural rights are just as popular, if not more so, than civil and political rights. In particular, rights to health, housing and social security poll very well. Second, as the reformist post-Second World War spirit developed a conception of human rights anchored in a holistic view of man's needs and entitlements, it is perhaps unsurprising that the subsequent unevenness of their treatment has contributed to the relative unpopularity of human rights as we know them. For the rights that one would expect to resonate most in ordinary people's everyday life are the very ones the courts have been prevented from protecting, despite widespread material injustices. Meantime, the tabloids and other opponents of human rights, at least in the UK, have been able to portray them as the enemy of the people and the friend of criminals and asylum seekers, insofar as they bother to distinguish between the two. So without economic, social and cultural rights, human rights are, at best, a sideshow, and at worst, a legitimizer of sin and evil. In this context, therefore, arguably, civil and political rights need economic, social and cultural rights more than the other way around. And so ultimately, it's through this prism that the objections to economic, social and cultural rights must be judged. Do they really merit the complete exclusion of economic, social and cultural rights from the clutch of constitutionally protected rights, despite their historical pedigree, moral or political resonance, and central importance to the survival of the human rights project? Turning to the first of those, they can't be human rights because they require positive action from others. Now, the libertarian view is that man is born free and may resist any interference with that freedom, but cannot, as of right, call on the actions of others, for that would violate the other person's right to be free. Thankfully, today at least, we don't need to debate the veracity of that claim, dubious as it is, because this first objection is based on a false description of human rights, in particular economic and social rights, because civil and political rights also depend on the positive obligations of others, both explicitly, for example, the right to fair trial and the right to hold elections are obvious examples, and implicitly through judicial interpretation. The right to life, the right not to be subjected to inhuman or degrading treatment, the right to privacy, family life, the right to protest, the right to religion, and of course the right to property, have all been interpreted so as to include positive obligations on the state. Even last week, the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom was debating the extent to which Article 3 gave people a right to have allegations of criminal conduct investigated by the police, as of right. So in reality, the cohort of civil and political rights is shot through with positive obligations, but no one seriously argues that they are not human rights. So moving on to the second objection, economic, social and cultural rights are not justiciable by the courts. Central to this objection is the issue of resources. Economic, social and cultural rights depend on resources for their fulfilment, and as resources are finite, no one can have an inherent right to anything. Yet, as we've just seen, civil and political rights often involve positive obligations on the state, and with them, questions of resources arise. The courts therefore frequently already make decisions with resource implications, balancing the rights of individuals against the rights of others, in the form of, often, the public finances. Indeed, it is the very stuff of human rights adjudication to determine issues of necessity and proportionality in this context. Allied to these concerns about resources is another, rather anachronistic dichotomy, namely the one between law and policy. Of course, policy is for policymakers and law is for lawmakers, but there has always been an overlap. And the line between the two is not so much as being blurred as fluid. And again, anyway, civil and political rights adjudication already has judges embarking on inquiries into the context of social policy and state entitlements. To take a couple of examples. The right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment has meant that asylum seekers couldn't be denied all support and the right to work simply because they haven't made their applications for asylum properly on their arrival in the UK. As was stated by the Court of Appeal, there is a stage at which the dictates of humanity require the state to intervene to prevent any person within its jurisdiction suffering dire consequences as a result of deprivation of sustenance. If support is necessary to prevent a person in this country reaching the point of Article 3 degradation, then that support should be provided. And second, whilst this principle, the Linguela principle, as it's often described, may not extend far into social assistance or healthcare, for example, the courts are nevertheless routinely tasked with examining whether or not state entitlements are being distributed in a discriminatory fashion, in breach of Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, another civil political right. That task requires the court to establish whether there is a discriminatory treatment, and if there is, whether it's objectively justified, having regard to the stated aims of the measures in question. High-profile examples have included the UK's two recent flagship welfare reforms, the benefit, the veteran tax, and the overall benefit cap. The former was found to be unlawful because it discriminated against disabled people, and the latter was only upheld 3-2, the minority declaring the cap to be disproportionately targeted against single mothers with more than 2 children, the group least able to move from welfare to work. And in both these scenarios, the court afforded the government a very considerable latitude, in the same way that the European courts give member states a wide margin of appreciation. And even though the stated objectives of the government included deficit reduction, the court nevertheless asked whether the ends were rationally connected to the means, and as part of that analysis, whether there might have been another way. Of course, some judges are more inclined to intervene than others, and there are legitimate arguments to be had about exactly where the line should be drawn. It was ever thus. Generally speaking, however, judges are very keen to demonstrate proper respect for the government's expertise and role as primary decision-maker. They are careful not to assume to know what they cannot know. The Strasbourg Court, the European Court of Human Rights, has too, on occasion, made decisions under the guise of civil and political rights, which have resource implications in the field of social policy. So in certain circumstances, for example, the right to fair trial comes with the right to receive free legal aid. And mass evictions have been suspended, pending the state making alternative homes available. These cases are, in my view, also living proof of the true indivisibility of social and cultural rights and civil and political rights. Indeed, the stock phrase the Strasbourg Court uses when it's doing this sort of thing is to say that they are ensuring human rights are real and effective rather than theoretical and illusory. Basically, that's an implicit recognition that you can't have one without the other. But there are limits to this construing of civil and political rights so as to tackle violations of social rights. Predictably, the courts can be accused of overreach when they do it. And it produces some strange results. For example, in the mass eviction case I just mentioned, the court said the Romans' right to respect their home would be breached by their eviction from the unlawful encampment they'd be living in, essentially because the Bulgarian authorities hadn't done enough to find them somewhere else to live. Whilst all the while nervously proclaiming again and again that of course there was no right to a home under the European Convention. The decision meant that any member of that community who decided against joining the illegal encampment remained homeless, whereas those who broke the law were ultimately rewarded. This is hardly an intellectually coherent basis for addressing the very serious problems of homelessness amongst Europe's most disadvantaged and discriminated people. All of that mental gymnastics could have been avoided if the court could have been just able to say, well, actually, there is a right to housing, and in the particular circumstances of this case, it's been breached. So perhaps the problem is not really with the functional ability of the courts to adjudicate on economic, social, and cultural rights, but that we haven't actually given them the tools they need to do their job properly, which is to eradicate injustice. Either way, in relation to the objection, the fact is that in the field of existing human rights, by which I mean civil and political rights, the courts already adjudicate on resource-intensive issues that concern social policy. And as far as we can all tell, the house is yet to fall down. But of course, we must acknowledge that full incorporation of economic, social and cultural rights alongside civil and political rights would undoubtedly expand the scope of judicial review further into the realm of social policy, with a corresponding upscaling in the judicialisation of lawmaking and administrative decision-making. And at this spectrum, the focus of the detractors shifts, and they ask less whether the courts are capable of enforcing these rights, but whether they ought to be allowed to do so. To some, of both left and right political persuasion, this level of judicial oversight will undermine democracy by placing too much power in the hands of judges. This merits some serious attention. Judges are not elected and cannot be expected to know, still less represent the will of the people. But in my view, the answer lies to this objection in examining the content of economic, social and cultural rights and the obligations they entail. There are three dynamics to this. Again, you'll hopefully hear more about this today, so I'm just going to say a little by way of introduction in relation to all three. First, as already discussed, economic and social rights already require resources and possible steps to be undertaken by the state. But not always. Right to just conditions of work, for example, or equal pay between men and women do not obviously require public expenditure, even if they do require public action. In fact, individual rights are best seen as bundles of rights that coalesce around particular substantive issues like housing, health or education, for example. The human rights institutions have developed a tripartite set of requirements. You will hear a lot about these in the course of the day. The first is respect. So the state must refrain from interfering wherever possible with somebody else's livelihood or, for example, overly taxing an occupational pension fund. Second, the state must protect the rights. It must take steps to prevent third parties from interfering with somebody else's rights. Perhaps, for example, it would be obligated to stop Philip Green walking off with somebody's entire pension fund. Fulfill. The final obligation is the state must, on occasion, take active steps to ensure somebody's rights are fulfilled by, for example, starting a state pension scheme. The second aspect about the content of economic social rights is that in substantive terms, they provide much more than mere minimum standards. In the same way that what is required for a fair trial has evolved over time, so too is our understanding of an adequate standard of living, or the highest attainable standard of health, or effective participation in cultural life. The conditions necessary for human flourishing are recognised to be greater than what is needed merely to survive. To those who are new to this topic, this sometimes comes as a surprise. Intuitively, people think about these rights and think, well, they must have material limits. And it is true that they probably do have outer edges. No one has yet maintained, for example, a right to go to the opera as part of the right to cultural life. But it's not really surprising that the jurisprudence of the courts rarely seeks to set down exactly how many calories we need or how many pairs of shoes we need in order to ensure these rights are protected. That task would be a deceptively difficult one, and temporal in nature, and inevitably curtail the utility of these rights. So they're not about minimum standards. Third, and critically, however, the full realisation of these rights in the covenant is not an absolute duty. The state parties' obligations are governed by Article 2.1 of the covenant. And it says this: each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take steps, individually and through international systems and cooperation, especially economic and technical, for the maximum of its available resources, with a view to achieving progressively the full realisation of the rights recognised in the present covenant by all appropriate means, including particularly the adoption of legislative measures. Now, the UN is not known for its clear and precise language, but what that effectively amounts to is this: that the obligation is to progressively realise the rights over time. And that is to be achieved by using all appropriate means, particularly legislative measures, and, critically, using the maximum available resources. Therefore, as with all law, context is everything. The duty of progressive realisation is why, for example, it is wrong to assume that violations of economic, social and cultural rights only ever happen in poor countries. On the contrary, there's often wealthy countries that are guilty of persistent poverty or inequalities in, for example, health outcomes. Indeed, as I will mention later on, in-country inequality represents one of the biggest threats to the fulfillment of economic, social and cultural rights, even in wealthy countries. The committee, remember the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, has explained that the Article 2.1 obligations include obligations of conduct and indeed of outcome. And they also include immediate obligations to do things straight away and ones that may be achieved over time. And the immediate ones are some of the ones I've already mentioned about, for example, ensuring equality of treatment between men and women, or, for example, other aspects of equality law. Similarly, there are immediate obligations on the states to collect the appropriate data to ensure they can assess their own progress and indeed allow others to assess their progress so they are accountable to the committee. They must gather the right data, benchmark progress and look to identify deficiencies. They must also do impact assessments. Whenever they're enacting new legislation or new policy, they must ask themselves what are the implications of this going to be for human rights. But beyond all of these immediate obligations, there is in essence a single one, which is to have a viable plan to achieve economic and social rights and to resource that plan effectively. And as the committee states, That duty is one to which it is a real duty. It's a duty to move expeditiously and effectively, as quickly as possible, towards the goal of full realisation. But of course, it doesn't specify the means by which that has to be done. In particular, the covenant is neutral, they say, and its principles cannot accurately be described as being predicated exclusively upon the need for or the desirability of a socialist or a capitalist system, or a mixed, centrally planned or laissez-faire economy, or indeed upon any particular approach. However, one key facet of this duty of progressive realisation, which I'll come back to in a moment, is that prima facie of these, it forbids retrogression in the fulfillment of progress. It prohibits states from taking the steps it might want to otherwise take if the result is going to be that people's enjoyment of rights goes backwards rather than forward. So what does all of this amount to? Would it represent an unwise and unwelcome intrusion by judges if we allow them to enforce economic and social rights? You will all have your own views, but there are 5 points worth considering. First is, politicians do not always have a plan. Some problems are simply too big or indeed too small. Sometimes politicians just don't want to grasp the nettle. The decision to do nothing is not always because there is nothing to do. One thinks of examples, human trafficking, for example, zero-hour contracts and collective bargaining, absence of job opportunities for people with disabilities, or properly adapted homes for people with disabilities. Matters of great social injustice that, for one reason or another, the politicians are failing to grasp. EU law already does this to some extent, and trafficking is a good example. EU law has certainly stimulated better protection for people that traffic in the UK and Ireland. Economic and social rights would do something similar. Second, the courts would ensure that programmes for social justice are properly financed. One just thinks of obvious examples, adult social care or the protection of mental health. The court could ask the question, is the pot actually large enough? Now, it would be very rare for courts to say precisely how much money is necessary. But what the government could do, the courts could do, is hold the government to account. If the government gets elected on the basis that it's going to solve a particular social problem, but then doesn't fund it, why shouldn't the courts be entitled to ask the question why? Third, rational implementation. What is the evidence base for the particular policy? For example, do benefit sanctions work? Do they actually result in more people moving into work, or do they just increase the demand for food bags, for example? Fourth, proportionality. Is it right to reduce the benefits of families simply because they are large, or they live in more expensive parts of the country? Have the policymakers considered whether there might be another way of cutting costs in the medium to long term? Might it be better, for example, to give those single mothers free childcare so that they can obtain work that way, rather than simply cutting their benefits and hoping that that spurs them into action? And fifth, finally, exceptionally, the court might ask whether or not basic minimum standards are being protected. Can an asylum seeker, for example, meet his or her basic needs with a mere £35 a week? Is it right that a pregnant woman who's unlawfully present in the country should be denied full maternity care? Categorically, however, what the courts would not do if they had enforceable economic and social rights is devise the policies they think best and the policies they think will address the problems in lieu of the government doing so. Instead, what the courts will do is review government action against certain measurable principles, with the possibility, of course, that it might force a shift in priorities where it is necessary to do so in order to respect the essence of the rights. But in all the scenarios I've just set out, the threshold for intervention by the court would undoubtedly be set very high. The politicians are trained not to enter the political fray unless it's absolutely necessary to do so. And the effect of all of this would, in my view, act as a deterrent. It would also mean that policymakers were more inclined to produce evidence-based policy rather than knee-jerk reactions or opportunistic policy if they think that courts might find them out, might identify that there isn't in fact a proper evidential basis for the particular policy they want to pursue. So enforceable economic and social rights would add to our tools of holding the government to account. without allowing the courts to stray into the territory of becoming policymakers. Would that really be such a bad thing? Now, of course, there is always the scope for some more fundamental disagreement between the courts. But we already have that. And it would very seldom arise anyway. But it is the essence of constitutionally protected rights that they should have anti-majoritarian capabilities. As was said by a US Supreme Court judge, the purpose of constitutional rights is to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied and protected by the courts. So there we have it. The objections are either without foundation or are readily addressed by a proper understanding of the content of the rights, at least in my view. I am conscious, however, that I have to some extent sought to answer the case against economic and social rights by merely highlighting what we already do, by arguing that it wouldn't really be any different if we had implemented economic and social rights. This is because I genuinely believe that such a change would not be the quantum leap that many assume, or at least have us believe it would be. However, you might be tempted to ask why we need all of these extra rights. Perhaps they're already meaningful enough. What is all the fuss about? Well, the list I mentioned a moment ago is one way of answering that. They are all social problems that one cannot readily bring to the attention of the court, for there is no overarching rights framework by which to reference the claim. I sometimes describe that as the scope of judicial review problem. However, there are, in my view, deeper, more profound reasons why it's now the time to take economic, social and cultural rights more seriously, and I've identified 4 of them. The first is human rights in crisis. Like civil and political rights, their significance fluctuates with the times and the context in which they are invoked. When crisis strikes, the trust we place in our normative frameworks and the institutions that uphold them can be simultaneously challenged and vindicated. The Human Rights Act came only 12 months before 9/11, but its provisions implemented by the UK courts played a critical role in stopping the UK government from perpetuating the mistakes of the past, or all of them at least, in the face of the unprecedented threat of global terrorism. The court stood firm and protected the right not to be detained without trial, with Lord Hoffman famously saying it was not terrorism that threatened the life of the nation, but rules like the one the court was asked to consider. So these apolitical rights, the product of atrocities gone by, gave the court the justification and the means to stop the politicians from acting on their convictions and disregarding the invaluable lessons of the past in the face of the war on terror. The global financial crisis was also portrayed as an unprecedented event. The policy response has certainly seen unprecedented cuts to public expenditure and living standards in the form of austerity in many parts of the world. But just as with civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights jurisprudence stresses that it's in times of crisis that we must be extra vigilant to ensure that we comply with human rights. They are not luxuries only to be invoked when times are good. Now, of course, in order to be credible, human rights must be realistic. So the committee recognises that in times of economic adversity, it may not be possible to progressively realise economic social rights or even maintain current levels. Therefore, retrogression in the enjoyment of economic social rights can be compliant with the convention, covenant, so long as the state party establishes the prevalence of certain conditions, namely that the measures are temporary, necessary, proportionate, non-discriminatory, do not result in a disproportionate adverse impact on the rights of disadvantaged and marginalised groups, and respect the core content of the rights. Now, can there be any serious doubt about the virtue of that test? Certainly no state party to the covenant has proclaimed it to be bad law. And notably, after the crisis, no politician asked the public for a mandate to introduce an unnecessary programme of permanent austerity measures deliberately designed to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. In the UK, at least, George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, told us explicitly that we were all in this together, and And whilst there had to be short-term pain, it would soon be offset by a glorious economic recovery, with the most vulnerable people remaining protected throughout. That type of austerity programme would have passed the committee's test. So why should George and his like be so reluctant to have an independent judicial body examine the evidence and apply that test? Well, in 2016, the committee did just that. As part of its periodic review of the UK, it found the UK had failed the test. In the context of worsening standards of living, significant increases in homelessness, exponential increases in demand for food banks, 50% increase in child poverty, and persistent social inequalities, the government was unable to show that its decision to cut inheritance tax and corporation tax and increase VAT was necessary. In other words, it was not able to show that it was using the maximum of its available resources to ensure fulfilment of economic, social and cultural rights. It was also clear to the committee that the cuts to social security and social care that had been implemented as part of the austerity programme had disproportionately impacted people with disabilities and lone parents. So, as it turned out, George, we weren't all in it together. Some of us were in it, while some of us were having it. And the committee's observations about the UK were eerily similar to those it made about Ireland some 12 months earlier. Legitimate questions have to be asked about whether or not the 8 years of austerity was worth it in Ireland. Indeed, Ireland's mantle as the poster boy of austerity-based recovery appears to be slipping. Some are even asking whether austerity even caused the recovery at all. Was there in fact another way of doing things all along? And indeed, the committee have made very similar findings in relation to the Czech Republic, Portugal, Slovakia, Romania and Spain, all countries which executed a programme of austerity reforms, and all countries in which the committee had legitimate reasons for querying whether or not it was really necessary to do it, or certainly to do it in the way that those countries did it. And in light of that fact, it's perhaps little wonder that the UK and other countries are keen to avoid these rights being enforceable directly, because they might not like the result. Now, these condemnatory reports of the UN are all very well and good in themselves, and they can be used to embarrass or even cajole governments into taking different measures. Indeed, in default of that, people can always vote for somebody else. But that doesn't do much for the people who were affected by them. In times of crisis, it seems, the terrorists and the criminals get their human rights, but the single mother of 3 children, one of whom is disabled, does not. As I alluded to earlier, this may have consequences for human rights generally. We are already witnessing various manifestations of a regressive human rights culture. And only a fool would have us believe that there won't be further economic shocks in the future. They are as inevitable as the wind. Surely now is the time to strengthen, therefore, the foundations of our democracies, so that when the next one blows into town, we can be sure, rather than merely hope, that economic, social and cultural rights will be protected. The second deeper reason why I think we need these rights now is inequality. Alongside human rights, the post-Second World War period also gave rise to the fixation with economic growth, or more specifically, gross domestic product, GDP. In fact, economic growth and human rights are understood to be mutually reinforcing. Strong civic structures, predictable government, and the rule of law, including civil rights, allow businesses to prosper, thereby generating the wealth necessary to meet and ultimately exceed the requirements of economic, social and cultural rights. Except this is not what happened, at least not all of the time. Economic growth has sometimes come at the cost of, or despite, violations of civil and political rights. Similarly, growth has not always meant economic, social and cultural rights are protected. Indeed, the catalyst behind the resurgence behind economic, social and cultural rights in the 1980s was the perceived inequities of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund's, structural adjustment programs in developing countries. The necessary adjustments always included the liberalisation of markets and cuts in state programs which benefited the poor, all because these were perceived to be inefficient and because the desire was to make these countries more attractive to foreign investors. And sometimes these programs did lead to significant and impressive gains in GDP. But the problem was that the gains were not evenly spread, if they were spread at all. The result was that inequality grew on a very grand scale. At the end of the colonial period, the ratio of the richest to the poorest countries was 35 to 1. It has since grown to almost 80 to 1. Countries like India and Brazil saw massive increases in wealth alongside huge social problems, including, for example, in India, 200 million underfed people, despite having no droughts and plenty of food. This seems wrong. Did the economic growth actually require such high levels of inequality, or was it simply a case of the powerful extracting all that they could? Something similar has happened in post-austerity Europe. Despite the crisis, inequality has got much worse. As we've seen, public services were cut whilst tax systems were unreformed or even made more aggressive. Was that necessary? Yes, the Celtic phoenix has now risen, but the tragedy of Jonathan Corrie and others symbolises another side of the story. Which strong economic, social and cultural rights have prevented the recovery from taking place? Or have simply prevented it from being so unevenly distributed when it did? This is all the more poignant now that we know from Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in their book, The Spirit Level, that inequality is bad for us per se. By nearly all social indicators, unequal countries do less well, with greater levels of inequality being directly associated with higher incidences of ill health, unhappiness, violent crime, and family breakdown. Equally worrying, Thomas Piketty has demonstrated that returns on own capital have outstripped growth the world over. The system, therefore, will continue to generate more inequality unless something changes. So can the markets be trusted to settle upon the John Rawls equilibrium, where only so much inequality is tolerated as benefits the least well off? Or does the state need to intervene? And if the state won't intervene, should the courts make them? Despite large-scale protest and concern in the West around inequality, one thinks of the Occupy movement, etc., and Obama describing it as the defining issue of our age, there has been a complete dearth of policy responses. Governments have not acted. So would enforceable economic, social and cultural rights help? Well, in India and South America, the two countries I mentioned, improvements have been made as a consequence of enforcing those rights. They have not been a panacea, they have not solved all the problems, let's be frank, but they did make a contribution. At the very least, they should mean that inequality is less than it would otherwise have been, without there being any good evidence that enforceable rights would have in some way hindered economic growth. Indeed, there is now some evidence coming together that suggests that where you have enforceable economic, social and cultural rights, growth improves. Rather than these rights being a drag on growth, they enhance growth. So that's the second reason I say now is the time to think about economic and social rights more seriously, because of the problem of inequality. The third and fourth I take very quickly. The third is globalisation and financial institutions. When accused of breaching economic, social and cultural rights as part of their austerity programmes, both Greece and Ireland have with some justification pointed the finger at the Troika, that is the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank and the European Commission, which is those organisations in the form of the Troika that demanded the conditions that necessitated the cuts to public services that led to the drastic decline in living conditions and thereby the breach of economic, social and cultural rights. These institutions are not, despite the very best efforts of some very creative lawyers, bound by the international agreements that seek to protect economic, social and cultural rights. However, politically, those states that are parties to the covenant but hadn't domestically enforced these rights were completely undermined in their efforts to push back against the will of these global institutions because they weren't able to point to their own constitutional protections and say, we simply can't do it. Our own law doesn't allow us to. Therefore, as a consequence, everything was up for grabs. And guess what? The party with the strongest hand ended up winning the game. So there's another reason why we need these rights. The world is becoming ever more globalised, and ultimately global institutions have the ability to make countries introduce reforms that the people wouldn't otherwise have accepted and have no way of resisting. The fourth and final one concerns populism and the problem of knowledge. In the UK, we weren't able to blame the Troika when austerity didn't work. So who did we blame instead? Well, in a word, I'm afraid it was you. The Euro countries were to blame. It was the collapse of demand in Europe which led to the need for austerity. Even though Britain is a net importer of European goods. The government also blamed the unstoppable flow of migrant labour from Europe into the UK as being the reason why we could no longer afford public services. And what happened next? Well, there was this man called Nigel Farage who stood up and, well, the rest is history. But my point is a serious one. In an increasingly complex world, arguably the value of institutions and mechanisms for establishing the truth has never been greater. A robust system of justice implemented by independent judges is flawed, for sure, but maybe the best we've got, because sometimes we really do need somebody just to tell us whether the news is fake or not. Giving the courts the ability to adjudicate on these issues, in the manner I said earlier, would, in my view at least, deter governments from introducing policies they knew wouldn't stack up when a court reviewed the evidence. So in conclusion, it is my view that we face times of unprecedented change, particularly in Western Europe and America. Our social democracies no longer guarantee progressive realisation of living standards, and the ideological underpinnings of our societies have loosened as a result. We have massive levels of inequality within our borders, and if we are to stem the rise of populism and political opportunism, we need, amongst other things, because as I say, human rights are not a panacea, we need a normative framework that we can all understand, believe in, and trust to guide us in the right direction. Otherwise, we risk being blown off course in these high political winds, susceptible to the political vagaries of our time and the seductive charms of flash old attorneys, beer-drinking ex-commodity dealers, failed real estate agents, or even kindly, but ultimately ineffective geography teacher lookalikes. Meantime, time and time again, the same people end up ignored, neglected, and exploited. And that harms all of us. The framework and the mechanisms we need are there. We just need to pick them up and make them more meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. That was a really comprehensive range of points which I'm sure people will want to digest afterwards when the paper is available. We'll pull all the papers from today's seminar or conference together afterwards and make them available on the website. I must admit I was struck by a couple of points which relate to those of us who are fighting on various fronts. One was this division, or non-division between law and policy, and the idea that you might give courts the tools to make prudent judgments rather than condemning them for what they might do. And the second one brought to mind the assertion that representative democracy is the very zenith of democratic participation, which TVs will, or members of Parliament will constantly inform us, gives them the right to hold say over resources. Okay, thank you very much, Jim.